So there are two writing assignments left. One is the last of the Restoration of the Ancient Order of Things. That essay is due the 14th. And then the larger one, the critical review of David Lipscomb's on civil government, is due the 21st. So 2 weeks. 1 week from this Friday is the last of the smaller essays. 2 weeks from this Friday is the last critical review.
I went online. It's not posted yet.
It should be. Okay. It should be available. Hold on a second. Let me. I know earlier this semester I was having problems getting it linked right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. That's why I got on that.
All right. Well, I will double check and see if there's maybe they moved it or something. Yeah, I'll double check on that and see if I can find the.
Well, I feel better.
Fix the link.
I feel better knowing it's not isolated.
Yeah. It's one of those things where something happens like where you can't get the file. Is there something wrong with my computer, or is there something wrong with it? All right. So I will double check that this afternoon, make sure to get the right link. I had problems earlier in the semester with it, but I thought I had gotten it where it was linking properly. But so don't forget those last two assignments coming up. This week we're going to be looking at the disciples of Christ and the Christian churches, the independent Christian churches, which are the two other streams of the Restoration movement here. Of course, we kind of have recognized there is a split that took place at the beginning of the 20th century. That was kind of finalized. The split had been brewing since the middle of the 19th century. But the disciples of Christ will undergo another split in the 20th century, which will lead to the formation of the independent Christian churches. So I want to kind of set the stage a little bit for some of the places where the disciples are going, which is partly why the second split will happen as well. And we highlighted some of these things when we were talking about the 19th century, but I want to kind of bring your attention back to them because of how significant they are in the development of American Christianity, but especially the Restoration movement. Largely, from a theological standpoint, very important in the development of the disciples of Christ is the acceptance of a liberal approach to theology that had been developing in Protestantism in general. And there are a couple of things that feed into that. One of those is the development of Darwinism. Now, there had been, prior to Charles Darwin, people who had suggested, hypothesized, theorized that human beings, or at least species in the natural world, if not human beings included in that, had evolved over time. The particular thing that Darwin contributes to that discussion, that really popularizes that idea and really makes it more mainstream and more broadly accepted, is the way he described how that evolution took place. Prior to Darwin, a lot of people who believed in evolution, many of them would have thought of it as kind of a God-directed process, or a process that left human beings out of the equation. And so even prior to Darwin, there were people that postulated that the Earth was older than perhaps what would have been indicated in a literal reading of Genesis. There were other indications that in the development of fossils. So a lot of this 19th century geology is coming into its own, astronomy, some of these other scientific fields. But Darwin provides a way in which you could understand the development of the diversity of life on Earth without an appeal to a creator guiding the process. And so, it's kind of evolution prior to this point. I mean, it wasn't a widespread view, but the people that looked at it tended to have kind of a God's directing this. So what Darwin contributes is this idea of natural selection being the means by which evolution takes place. So essentially the idea is that species within an environment, some of them are going to be better suited to survive in that environment and reproduce. And those genes that are related to those particular traits are the ones that are going to be passed on, because they're the ones those are the species, those are the animals that are going to reproduce. And so given enough time, right, billions of years, the idea is that it's just a undirected happenstance of what happens to be the most fit for a particular environment. And so Darwin provides this idea of being able to talk about the origin of species, which is essentially, that's the title of his book, right, On the Origin of Species, without the need for God. Now, Darwin himself appears to have been more an agnostic than a dogmatic atheist, probably leaning more towards the atheistic side. He was trained in theology, is kind of where he gets his educational background. But on the other hand,
also he had some
he had some theological training, and
obviously he was a complete atheist, so he really was more
agnostic. He wasn't. I mean, he probably leaned atheistically, but he would allow for the possibility that somebody could still believe in a God, yet also believe in natural selection and evolution. Right? So he's not completely denying, as a lot of atheistic naturalists would today, that science demands atheism. But that's not necessarily where Darwin was. Which, of course, once you start postulating this idea of millions and billions of years and the just natural selection of certain species, that does raise the question of what do you do about those passages, particularly at the beginning of the book of Genesis, that indicate that a divine being, God, specially created the universe, the things in the universe, but more importantly, human beings. How do these two things relate? And Darwin, of course, claimed that human beings and apes had a common ancestor, so it's denying any sort of special creation. And that was
cool. He gonna look dead. Oh, I just figured about this though, for real. You tried to say that all humans came from one ancestor and that was an ape.
Yeah, so a lot of people took this as we're descended from monkeys. Well, that's not exactly what Darwin was saying.
I'm sorry.
That's all right.
Interrupted.
That's all right. So here are Christians faced with this scientific postulate. And there were some individuals who very quickly Darwin's views were accepted in the scientific community. So that by the end of the 19th century it is very, very prominent. But the question, of course, becomes in the kind of theological religious community, how do you understand this? And so a group that would become liberal Protestants sought to find ways to adjust Christianity to science. Now, one of the places where liberal Protestants tended to break with Darwin on some things was human beings, the issue of human beings. And so many liberal Protestants in the 19th century thought of human beings as being a special creation by God, endowed with a soul, and other life forms had been allowed to develop through natural selection. And of course, we talked about fundamentalism and how fundamentalism responds to this, and it was, really a deep concern. But what you have here is this development within this more liberal form of Protestantism that is willing to adjust Christianity, or the truth of Christianity, to science and modern culture. And that's reflected in biblical studies as well. We've talked about higher criticism, these questions about the origins of the Bible. So if human beings evolved as a species, then it would make sense that their culture would evolve as a species, and part of their culture would be religion. And so religion, it would then be assumed, evolved over time from more primitive types, I use that in quotations, more primitive types of religion to higher forms of religion. And so a lot of people kind of started developing this idea of, that religions had developed over time, and so the most primitive, again, using that term, and because that's just the term that they use, not necessarily a term I would, use, but this is the term that was being used. So the indigenous peoples of Africa and the Americas, the Aborigines of Australia, these were often looked upon as the the primitive forms of religion, and gradually that became kind of a pantheism where there's these spirit beings, animism, which is this idea of spirits within nature, pantheisms, there's kind of a spirit pervading the universe, to a polytheism of multiple gods, to eventually a monotheism, that there is one God.
So animism is what again? That's all.
Animism.
Oh, animism.
Animism. A-N-I-M-I-S-M. That's the notion that there's these spirits that inhabit things like animals, trees, sometimes even rocks, other aspects of nature. Right? So you start with this kind of, there's a belief and there's this power that pervades the universe, to there are these more identifiable types of beings, to deities, multiple deities, to eventually the idea of there's one God. And so some liberal Protestants were open to this. And of course, this is where kind of higher criticism comes in, with this idea that if a religion evolved, maybe the Bible itself evolved over time. Because there is, of course, this major question. If religion is something that evolved over time, what does that do about the Bible? The Bible doesn't become, in that kind of model, necessarily something special, but a higher form of culture. It's kind of a greater piece of literature. Well, certainly it's divine in the truths it relates to us about the human condition, but you start accepting, as fundamentalists point out, you start accepting some of these things related to natural selection and the evolution of culture, and it does kind of undercut some of the foundations of a belief in the special inspiration of the Bible, let alone a belief in anything resembling the Christian God. And so higher criticism was this developed in universities in Germany as an attempt to talk about the evolution of biblical texts. One of the first ones that develops, of course, and I believe we've talked about this before, was a theory that the books of Moses were not really written by Moses, but were composed over several centuries as various authors, the works of various authors were put together. And so you're kind of denying the idea that had been traditional for thousands of years, right? That Moses wrote those opening books. And there's even good evidence in other books in the Old Testament, as well as some of the comments Jesus makes, connecting authorship with Moses. Now, certainly, it would make sense that maybe some other people were involved in that. Right? Deuteronomy chapter 34, for example, ends with Moses' death. So it's probably more likely that instead of God inspiring Moses to write down how he's going to die, and then him dying, it's more likely that somebody like Joshua or whatever contributed that last chapter. And then maybe there's some other places in those books where there were other people involved in it, but all around the same time, not over hundreds of years like what would be suggested by the higher critics. But once you kind of start accepting the idea of evolution, this idea of the evolution of biblical text doesn't sound that odd either. And so eventually these views make their way into the United States, and particularly to the universities and the seminaries, which of course then train ministers who then take them out into the churches. Kind of related to this was a questioning about the historicity of Jesus. So if you aren't even sure that God is kind of guiding all of this, and then you're not sure that the Bible itself is inspired, but is instead a product of human development, which would include both the books of Moses, but then in the New Testament, the Gospels, well, then you also then begin to question, well, what about what the Bible tells us about Jesus? And so there were people that began to believe that what was reflected in the Gospels, the Gospel accounts, weren't necessarily historical facts about the life of Jesus in Nazareth, but these greater stories about Jesus in Nazareth that provided meaning. We might use the term myth, but not in the sense of being false, but in a story that carries great meaning. And so there were a variety of theologians and others in the late 19th century who went on a quest to determine what can we know historically about Jesus. And so kind of a separation, even though Christian tradition and Scripture doesn't allow us this, but these people were thinking, well, you want to separate the Christ of theology from Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus of Nazareth is a real historical person from what Christians later claimed about Jesus. And so there was a variety of people in the 19th century who were writing things, lives of Jesus. In the early 20th century, it was pointed out by a man named Albert Schweitzer, he was a medical doctor, he was a philosopher, he was a musician, he was a theologian, he had a variety of advanced degrees, a missionary. He points out that often what you saw with how these people approached this question of the historical Jesus was like these people looking down a well. And so historically, looking through time, so you're looking down a well and seeing a reflection of yourself at the bottom and saying, oh, that's what Jesus was. And so if you happen to be a Marxist, it just so happens that Jesus was a Marxist. And if you're kind of politically liberal, it just so happens that Jesus was politically liberal. So it tells us more about the people at the time, Schweitzer claimed, than it tells us truly about Jesus. But of course there's that presupposition to begin with about, should you separate Jesus of Nazareth from Jesus the Christ? Is one a real person and another an invented being by early Christians? And a lot of more recent scholars have done a good job showing that, in the sense of, if Jesus of Nazareth was merely a human being who people thought was the Messiah and was going to be a great deliverer of them from freedom, if they truly thought that, and then Jesus died, why would they transform him into the Son of God, and what he was really here to do was it was a spiritual mission, not a political mission? A lot of more recent scholars have pointed out that just doesn't make sense. Right? Why you would hold on to it? Because in most cases with messianic movements of the first century in Judaism, if your Messiah died, right, the person you think the Messiah is the Messiah, that person dies or is captured by Rome or some other sort of failure, you either find a new Messiah or you move on. Right? You don't continue to try and develop, he really was the Messiah, even though he's dead now. Right? That doesn't seem to be the case. So why would that happen with Jesus of Nazareth when it doesn't happen with anybody else? If there wasn't something truly special about Jesus of Nazareth, in the sense of him being God in human form. I'm sorry, I'm going off on a tangent, but when talking about this, it always strikes me as how odd this really is. But what you have here is this kind of differentiation between what can be historically told about the things recorded in the Bible, and then the Bible itself being these grander stories that may not have any historical background. And so a lot of liberal Protestants, including including people within the Restoration movement, are adopting these things, are accepting these things, and that's causing them to look at Christianity differently, the Restoration movement differently, and so all of this is coming here in this latter 19th century, early 20th century. Also very important at the time as well, in the early 20th century, was a greater concern for the social working out of your Christian faith and how you related to society. We talked about this before, this kind of the rise in industrialism, the rise in urbanization, all lead to a variety of situations, making it very difficult for the poor, the lower class, immigrants, other things like that. So you have this conjoining of this liberal theology with a social concern in the social gospel by the 20th century, which begins to focus more on social transformation instead of individual conversion. Where fundamentalism goes to focus on greater individual conversion and individual salvation and less about social concern, the social gospel has gone the other way. Focus on social salvation, less on individual conversion. And you kind of see the same kind of thing developing in the split between the churches of Christ and the disciples of Christ as the disciples kind of go more into this social gospel. And so within all this, we have the development of what becomes known as liberal Protestantism. This adjusting of Christian beliefs and practices to more modern understandings of reality. Particularly important in this development were a couple of different thinkers, theologians in Europe, who shifted the foundation of Christianity in what we might call the historical acts of God to other aspects of human experience. So probably most of us in this class, whether online or face-to-face, would say that it is very important that the things recorded, the events and people recorded in the Bible are historical people and events that actually took place like they are written about in the Bible. But for a lot of liberal Protestants, with their acceptance of Darwinism, higher criticism, some other things, they're not able, they don't feel comfortable making those claims anymore. So what do you do then about Christianity when you essentially cut off the foundation? Well, Schleiermacher, Friedrich Schleiermacher, for example, turned to feeling and experience. That Christianity is about the feeling and the experience of something, and less about the historical events of what's recorded in the Bible. Schleiermacher was born in Prussia. It's part of modern-day Germany. His father was a Reformed pastor and a chaplain of the army. In the 19th century, Schleiermacher read a variety of philosophers that led him to question a variety of doctrines in Christianity, including the divinity of Christ, but he does move on to becoming a Reformed pastor and eventually teaching at a university. So for Schleiermacher, Christianity is grounded in feeling and experience, not so much morality and knowledge. Now, he's very heavily influenced by kind of this rejection of the Enlightenment emphasis on reason. The Enlightenment didn't emphasize reason so much that a lot of people in the 19th century kind of rejected that and said, yeah, the rise of Romanticism. This is more emotional. Particularly important for Schleiermacher was the notion of a feeling of dependence. That Christianity is about this feeling of dependence we have, where we feel the need to be dependent on something larger. And so any doctrines or teachings are simply additional things put on top of this feeling of dependence, which would allow people, he thought, to question the biblical text or reject certain elements of the historicity of the biblical text, while still being able to claim, at least in their minds, a notion of Christianity. And Christianity is not about literal truths or intellectual expounding of teaching in this mindset, but is about feelings. It's about the feeling of dependence. Søren Kierkegaard was another one of these theologians that helps develop this. Kierkegaard was Danish, he was from Denmark. Again, if you say Danish, I don't want anybody thinking he was a breakfast pastry. We don't use that term very much, right? So he's from Denmark. He's a Dane. He is Danish. He too is affected by these emotional currents that are going through Christianity in the 19th century. And additionally, he's also very concerned about how pagan the society that he's a part of really is. Right? It's supposed to be this Christian society. Denmark is at the time. But people aren't living that way. And so he feels like there's something wrong here that needs to be changed. And so the focus for Kierkegaard becomes, instead of reason or feeling, it's this notion of faith. And it is a faith that is, for Kierkegaard, a costly faith. It required risks. And so one of his books focuses on Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac and how important this is. This is the supreme example of this kind of faith because of how much Abraham was willing to risk in his service to God. Human existence for Kierkegaard is full of anguish and doubt and despair. And so the struggle for true Christianity is this struggle for human existence, a struggle for true selfhood. And so with the focus being human existence, his form of philosophy becomes known as existentialism, because it's focused on this notion of existence. So essentially there's a way in which these theologians, among other liberal Protestants, are really beginning to set the stage for people to try and continue to claim a Christian identity, while also leaving some of the deeply held truths of historical Christianity. So, very important for liberal Protestantism is the development of modernism. Modernism affirmed a couple of different things, or the philosophy supported a couple of different things that liberal Protestants are imbibing. One of those was the belief that diversity in beliefs was a positive good. And so instead of an idea of everybody believing the same thing, it was okay for people to believe different things. Now, that might be true in some respects, but you could see how this could be problematic in the context of religion, especially in Christianity, which emphasized certain truths that were exclusive truths. And so while people might have a multitude of views on God, they cannot all be right. So, for example, just the very simple statements of there is one God, there are multiple gods, there are no gods or God. Right? Those three statements cannot all be true. Somebody might believe them to be true, but they cannot all truly be true. There is either a God or there is not a God. And if there is a God, there is either one God or there are more than one God. And so if there is but one God, as Christianity and Judaism and Islam and other religions have taught, well, there seems to be something important there compared to somebody who would say there is no God. So the modernist outlook allowed for diversity and that kind of being a positive good, which kind of brings with it a relativistic outlook. If diverse positions are a positive for society, then it becomes very easy to suggest that truth is a relative concept. So what is true might not be true entirely, but only true in certain circumstances and for certain groups. Or as it's kind of reflected in a variety of things today. Well, that might be true for you, but it's not true for me. Again, there are probably some truths that might be certain food dish. Right? Somebody could say, well, this is the best thing I have ever eaten, and somebody else say, this is the worst thing I have ever eaten. And so, well, it could be true for you that that's the best thing you've ever eaten, and it can be true for somebody else that it's the worst thing. But there is a God. If that is true, it is true independent of whether you believe it to be true or not. And if there is but one God, it is true for you, it is true for me, it is true for everybody. And so to try something philosophical like that, or theological like that, has an exclusivity then. Of course, there are other more simplistic truths that we would say are absolutes. And even the modernist view, and of course we're living in an age that's even worse when it comes to relativism. Circles do not have corners. And it is not true for you that circles have corners. Right? I mean, a circle is a circle. Whether you want to admit that it's a circle or not, a circle is a circle. And of course, even the phrase, all truths are relative, cannot be a relative truth if it is truly true. So, it's kind of self-contradictory.
Yeah, I never thought about that. If two people try the same dish and one like it, the other one doesn't, it's still truth to that person
Right.
who think it's good, and truth to that person who think it's bad.
Right.
Yeah.
But as far if we would then turn to talk about what was in the dish and what made up the dish, that was true whether you liked it or not. About what went in that dish. Right. So even though there are elements where the truth could be relative, there are some elements where truth is not relative.
Does that go back right quick to truth being subjective, according to the individual?
Right. I mean, yeah, that would kind of be the same kind of thing. That it's true because I perceive it to be true.
Right.
Well, there are some things that are true whether you perceive it to be true or not. Certain people across the world have an existence, even though you've never perceived them. Right. And if there is a God, it doesn't matter whether you perceive God or not. God exists. While when we talk about tastes and we talk about individual experiences, yes, there is a subjectivity there. But then there are other elements that they have to be objective. It's not physically possible for a circle to have corners. It is not logically possible for a circle to have corners. Because a circle, by definition, does not have corners. And so if it has corners, it is not a circle. And so, whether you want to call it a circle or not, if it's got corners,
This was a long square.
it's something else, right? It could be a trapezoid, it could be a rhombus, it could be, a rectangle, it could be some other, hexagon or a hexagon, octagon, whatever. But if it's got corners, it's not a circle. But essentially, what we're talking about here is this kind of philosophical approach, not some other things. Connected with this, of course, is a positive attitude toward culture and science. We've seen, the modernist position that develops in the latter part of the 19th century into the 20th century really looked at science as one of the primary modes of discovering truth. And so philosophical truths, which would include theological truths, for a lot of modernists become subservient to what can be discovered scientifically. And related to that as well is, kind of the notion of recognition of a distinction in cultures, and that cultural adaptation is important when it comes to philosophical and theological truth. You can see how this could work out when you start talking about how the Bible might be lived out in our time, where people might say, well, there are certain elements in the Bible that don't fit with modern culture. And so we're going to ignore them, we're going to reinterpret them, we are going to do away with them. We're going to say, the Bible's not the inspired Word of God, right? There's all sorts of ways you can do that, but what you're doing here is allowing contemporary culture to influence the reading of the text, which means, whether people would like to admit it or not, that the text is subservient to culture instead of culture being subservient to the text. So, it's reflecting these changes that are taking place in how people are viewing the Bible. People that are the descendants of, the theological descendants of Martin Luther, John Calvin, all those individuals that emphasize so heavily sola scriptura, things like that related to the interpretation of Scripture. Also very important to the modernists was the individual conscience, which kind of makes sense growing out of the relativism and the affirmation of diversity. And also a lot of the experiential leanings of both existentialism, some of the things that Schleiermacher was saying. Which means that in the context of liberal Protestantism, especially in the United States, there were three basic ideas that Protestants held on to as foundation. One was the idea of adapting religious ideas to contemporary culture. Religious ideas, practices to modern culture. And so if it didn't fit in with modern culture, you changed the practice, you changed the belief instead of changing the culture. A second thing was the belief that God was more fully present among human beings as culture developed. So this idea of we experience God more as we evolve more as a culture, instead of the notion of God being fully present in the past in Jesus Christ, God inspiring the Bible in the past, and that should be the marker. The liberal Protestant view was more, well, we're gradually coming to know more about God than what they did back then when the Bible was written. And then thirdly, connected especially with that social gospel outlook, is that human society is gradually moving towards the kingdom of God. Very post-millennial outlook. Right? The human society is improving and gradually becoming more and more the kingdom of God. Which led a lot of liberal Protestants to look very positively on human nature and progress, and then drop some traditional views, traditional doctrines related to the sinfulness of human beings, including, for example, a lot of liberal Protestants have grown up in traditions that emphasize the notion of original sin, human depravity, that human beings were born sinful or depraved. Well, that just doesn't fit in with modern culture. So out it goes. The divinity of Jesus was reinterpreted as well. It was less about any sort of nature of Jesus and more of Jesus being an example of divine humanity. So he's not truly God in human form for the liberal Protestants, but he's showing us the way to live. Unless he's saying some things we don't like that don't fit with modern culture, in which case we can ignore those. All of that leads us into thinking about the disciples of Christ. And so that kind of sets the stage here for where the disciples are going. Now, the disciples didn't accept everything in liberal Protestants, but they were very heavily influenced by it. A lot of the people that stayed with the disciples, particularly those that were educated in German or American seminaries in the latter part of the 19th century, had been influenced by this idea of the Christian faith changing over time, and so you needed to constantly kind of be developing these culturally relevant expressions of religion. In addition, the disciples, liberal Protestants in general, are being influenced by these developing social scientific theories about religion. And so the social sciences are just kind of coming to the fore as well. Sociology, psychology, some other things like that. And so this idea of the influence of religion, how religion works, also very important, kind of in all of this, before we get to that, is how they are shifting where historically they had been theologically. So there's a lot of discussion in the circles of the disciples, particularly in the academics where you have the theologians and of course in the churches where he ministers, about this kind of post-millennial outlook, the improvement that society's making, the practicality of the Christian message, and a rather positive emphasis on an optimistic outlook on human abilities, especially those of Christians, and emphasizing human goodness rather than sin. Additionally, if the Christian faith is something that changes and modifies over time and should adapt to modern culture, then when you start looking at some of these other religious groups, the Presbyterians, the Methodists, the Anglicans, the Baptists, you have a little bit of a different outlook than what the Restoration movement had in the 19th century and what the Churches of Christ were developing in the 20th century. So, because they're shaped by this liberal Protestantism, they're open to diversity. Whereas the Churches of Christ are trying to emphasize that they have restored the New Testament church, and that the churches should look like the New Testament pattern. They believe that that's reflected in Churches of Christ. The disciples are taking more of the focus on unity. Right? So if we think of Restoration having kind of two focuses, one on doctrine, teaching, shape of Christianity, the other on unity. The disciples are taking the more unity focus, but their unity isn't the kind of the unity that Alexander Campbell was looking for example. Right? So when Campbell's talking about unity in the 19th century, or Stone's talking about unity in the 19th century, they're talking about people abandoning their denominations, getting rid of their denominational names, and focusing on working together and practicing together and living together under the simple New Testament pattern as they saw.
That's really the whole emphasis of this movement, honestly, right?
Yeah, and that's kind of where it starts. But for the disciples of Christ, by the 20th century, they've kind of abandoned some of that. And so the unity is not a unity of asking people to drop their denominational affiliation, but recognizing themselves as a denomination among denominations. Right? So instead of calling people out of that into a non-denominational Christianity, the disciples are starting to fit in with other liberal Protestant groups of the time. And they're kind of declining in their interest in restorationism. And their interest is in unity, not restoration of New Testament Christianity.
Now, the disciples of Christ, they don't exist today.
Yeah, it is.
They do?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, I just never hear. All of his churches. The
Churches of Christ. But the official name of the disciples, and we'll touch on this, we might get to it today, we might wait until Thursday. Christian Church, parentheses, Disciples of Christ, is the official name of the group. And there's at least one. Where is it? I pass it frequently, but I can't think where it is.
Wow.
Usually on their sign, and I believe this one here, at least this one here, Dorman has it, is a chalice, right, a cup with a cross kind of through the upper part of the cup. Yeah. Yeah, I'll have to look and see where it is, but yeah, but that's their symbol. Yeah, that's the symbol that you'll see on there, and it'll say Christian Church, but it'll also then in parentheses say that's Disciples of Christ. But like a lot of other liberal Protestant groups, the number of disciples has declined, especially in the latter part of the 20th century into the 21st century. There's not as many of them. It seems like that when the disciples and the Churches of Christ split, the larger group goes with the disciples. And so it's not a 50-50 split. But the Churches of Christ through the 20th century continue to grow. When the disciples, and we'll get to this will probably be more, well, we'll touch on it here in a little bit. When the when the disciples grow and when they split, the disciples start on a trajectory that actually leads to a decline in their numbers, while the Christian churches and the churches of Christ have increased in numbers rather slowly in the last couple decades. But and actually now for the Church of Christ, there's kind of a stagnant in the United States. There's kind of a stagnant. They've kind of reached. We're somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million. A lot of it depends on which poll or who's doing the study or whatever. Whereas the disciples are around 400, 500,000, I believe. Where at one point they were, I think at the beginning of the 20th century, they were over 1 million. So they've really, and a lot of liberal Protestant groups done that. United Churches of Christ, which is a different group. Certain mainline Methodist groups, certain mainline Presbyterian groups, Episcopalians, right? These are the kind of the mainline liberal Protestant denominations. Most of them have been declining for the past 50 or 60 years. And so the focus for the disciples is more on this unity, finding our place in the grand plethora of denominations in the United States. And so that's a mindset that's leading the disciples of Christ. But there's also an increasing structuralization and institutionalization that's taking place as well. Now, we talked about institutionalizing in churches of Christ with the development of colleges and orphan homes and national television programs and cooperative mission efforts, but still within the churches of Christ and in what the independent Christian churches as well, those connections are very loose. Right? Most congregations, we would say, are autonomous. There isn't a regional board or denominational oversight committee that sits over any sort of group of churches for either the Christian churches or the churches of Christ that kind of provides them guidelines like you might find within other groups. But within the disciples of Christ, throughout the latter part of the 19th century into the 20th century, you see this continual development towards a more denominational type of structure.
I'm sorry, Mr. B. You said churches of today are what?
Well, the churches of Christ and the Christian churches are very congregationally autonomous.
Okay.
But the disciples have developed a denominational structure. There is still the notion of congregational autonomy in the sense that the structure is supposedly not supposed to kind of interfere with the practice of the local congregation, but still there's very much a structure, an institutionalizing that takes place.
So that's within the disciples of Christ.
That's the more the disciples of Christ. And a lot of it comes out of those early steps with the American Christian Missionary Society. It provides the foundation for how the disciples especially think about what kind of ways can congregations work together. Now remember, American Christian Missionary Society, as it gets started in the 1840s, had the support of Alexander Campbell, but it also had opposition from a variety of other people in the Restoration movement who didn't think that such a organization was scriptural. And so you have these kind of two groups, but they mostly kind of got along. But during the Civil War, remember, the American Christian Missionary Society becomes very pro-union, says some very hurtful things about Southerners, including Southern Christians that were part of the Restoration movement. So there's this substantial backlash where some people who were originally supporters of it turn against it. And so in the post-Civil War period, the American Christian Missionary Society almost dies off.
So they did some cool things about stuff.
Yeah, I mean that whole, the South is in rebellion against the nation, and so that included, well, yeah, I mean those kind of things. But some of the things they were saying affected some of the Southern Christians, even who weren't supportive of slavery, who weren't slaveholders, who were in some of the border states. People like David Lipscomb, right? Who's not a slaveholder. He's against slavery. He doesn't like what's going on, but he lives in the South. And so, anyway, this sectional conflict damaged the organization. And so, in the post-Civil War period, it almost dies off, but gradually, through the efforts of a lot of Northern disciples, manages to kind of rejuvenate a little bit. And as it kind of is reviving, largely now independent of the Churches of Christ. Most of that southern group, most of the Churches of Christ have kind of abandoned it, so it's mostly the Northern disciples. Well, they gradually start developing a variety of committees within the American Christian Missionary Society that will eventually kind of split off and have their own independent organization that are focused on a variety of different issues. Eventually, there are like 30 different societies or committees that are developed out of the American Christian Missionary Society. I'm just going to talk about two that I think are pretty important. One of those was the Christian Women's Board of Missions. As you might expect, of course, the focus of this group was on missions. It starts in 1874, and as you might expect, also by the name, the focus of evangelism was on women and children, but it was also meant to engage women and children in mission work. And so the main focus is evangelizing women and children, but also providing opportunities for women and children to engage in mission work, both in the United States and in other countries. The group, the society, was managed entirely by women. Again, the name probably clues you off. You probably could figure that out on your own. But it did employ both male and female missionaries. And so men and women were both involved in that. Ultimately, it was kind of a connection of a variety of local congregational societies where women had been active in a variety of local churches. Eventually, the group also becomes concerned about a variety of other social issues like temperance, as we mentioned before, as well as suffrage, getting women the right to vote.
And what year today?
Developed in 1874. The Christian Women's Board of Missions becomes active in a variety of countries. India, however, is one of the places where there's some major efforts, and the board helps start schools, orphanages, hospitals there, in addition to churches, right? So it's doing mission work, but then there's also these other types of institutions that are being developed to help other types of issues. Another one of those committees or societies that's developing around the same time is the Foreign Christian Missionary Society. It was an effort to try and encourage disciples to be more active in foreign evangelism after the Civil War. However, the first several decades, or the first major groups of missionaries that are being sent, are not being sent to places that are what we might call non-Christian countries. They're being sent to places where, like England, Denmark, France, Constantinople, where people tend to be members of some Christian denomination of various kinds. So the early years appear to be trying to reach some of these countries and encourage them in to accept the restoration view of some variety of theological issues. But the group would then later send missionaries to Japan, India, eventually in the 20th century into Africa, in the later 19th century into Africa. Very important in the efforts of the Foreign Christian Missionary Society was a man named Archibald MacLean. Born in Canada, he was baptized into the disciples when he turned 18, or when he was 18, I should say. He goes to Bethany College, is educated there, decides to become a minister. He becomes the second executive secretary of the Foreign Christian Missionary Society, a very important role. But he also is preaching and traveling the United States extensively, speaking about the importance of missionary work, as well as trying to recruit missionaries, garner support for missionaries. He would also write several books on missions, a variety of pamphlets as well. And then he would later serve as the president of the Foreign Christian Missionary Society. So he becomes a very important individual in this missionary outlook and concern of the disciples. But as the 19th century develops and turns into the 20th century, you have all sorts of different, these are not just the only two out of those 30 that are focused on missions. So you have the American Christian Missionary Society to begin with, then you have this Christian Women's Board of Missions, and then you have the Foreign Christian Missionary Society, and then you have a couple other missionary groups, and then there are other groups as well focused on a variety of things related to the work of ministers. And there's sometimes some cooperation that is occurring between them. So, for example, the Christian Women's Board of Missions and the Foreign Christian Missionary Society might work together if they want to particularly focus on an area or something like that. So there's some cooperation taking place, but they're just all over the place with all these efforts. And so there are some within the disciples that decide what's needed is trying to bring all of these groups that have a missionary focus together and try to focus that and make it more concentrated, make it more organized. The societies are already cooperating anyway. Why not just formally have something that brings them all together? Plus, it's also beginning to wear people out because, as you might expect, all of these groups are appealing to people for donations. And so if you have 30 different groups at various times during the year sending your congregation something about contribute to this missionary effort, and then you have this other group saying contribute to this missionary effort, and this is, and you're just getting bombarded. And so a lot of the ministers, the churches were just getting weary of all these. And so it's like, okay, we need to kind of unify them, make this one organization. That way it can just be one, you're getting one call for donations, it's a focused group, etc. And so a unified organization was decided. Gerald, you have a question?
Yes. What year did the Foreign Christian Missionaries?
I don't have the specific date, but it was around the same time as the Christian Women's Board today, early 1870s.
Okay.
So it was suggested, let's bring all of this effort together and create an organization that is going to kind of fold all of these things in. It's still going to be interested in the same types of activities, but it's going to unify all of this. Well, there's a little bit of concern about this, as you might expect, right? Because even though these groups are all missionary groups, they have slightly different focus. Each of them has a slightly different focus. And so there's a concern that if we fold all of these into one organization, is our group going to be kind of lost in all of that, right? And so are they going to pay as much attention to what we're paying attention to now? Additionally, it was a concern for a lot of women involved in the Christian Women's Board of Missions, because this was a place where they had been involved in a variety of leadership roles. So what's going to happen here when they become part of this larger society? Are women still going to have the same kind of leadership roles? And we're really not talking about gender. It's too much about gender, but it is kind of there's some differing things taking place in the disciples being more open to women's leadership in roles like this. And so this concern developed. Others said, though, well, think about how much can be done when cooperation takes place. So they pointed to an effort that was undertaken by the disciples that was known as the Men in Millions movement. Essentially, it was a plan that was developed in 1913 to raise several $1 million, $6 million, for missions and bring in 100 new workers to the missionary field, or that would be involved in benevolent activities or education. Right? So trying to get more workers into professional Christian ministry. Maybe that's a good term, right? It's not just Christians evangelizing in their homes, those kind of things, but a minister, a teacher, a missionary in the field. Right? So you're trying to raise money for missions while also trying to get more people to commit to giving their lives to missionary types of endeavors. It starts off with a focus on members and the disciples who could donate $500 or more, right? So it starts targeting that upper level, and then gradually moves into the lower level. And all congregations, all members. But of course, World War I takes place. I think it was yesterday, is the 100th anniversary of the United States becoming involved in World War I. Right? So 1917, just a few years after this is getting started, they're a few years into it, right? Because this is a long-term plan. At the time, you don't raise $6 million. I mean, today, depending on what organization you're a part of, depending on the people you can reach, you can make millions. You can raise millions of dollars in a very short amount of time. But at this time, for the disciples, it's like we've got to do this over the course of several years.
World War I was what, from 1914 to 1918?
1914 to 1919. 1919.
Okay. So it was a 5-year war.
I believe so.
Wow.
I think that's the thing. I could be wrong about that. Maybe it was 1918.
Okay.
But yes, it's 4 or 5 years. It's 4 or 5 years, but we're coming in on the tail end of that.
Oh, I see.
And so it was predominantly just a European war until, and then eventually we're kind of brought in. And of course, that's disrupting a lot of things in the United States, and one of those is this fundraising type of effort. And of course, that decreases the amount of money that's being brought in. But after the war, the movement is kind of brought back up, and by 1919, the goal had been reached and surpassed. The goal originally was $6 million. $7.1 million were raised, and 8,000 disciples. They were looking for 100 new workers. 8,000 disciples of high school or college age pledged to consider. And consider, not exactly. Yeah, well, think about church or mission jobs. Now, I mean, obviously, that not all of those turned into that, but the likelihood that maybe they reached that goal of 100 actual new workers. And so, as people are developing this plan for this United Christian Missionary Society, it hasn't started yet, but they're pointing to things like the Men in Millions movement, saying, look, there was an example of how we came together as a movement right, came together as disciples and were able to surpass what our goals were. Other things are kind of pushing towards institutionalism, and so eventually the United Christian Missionary Society was formed. It was a combination of the American Christian Missionary Society, the Foreign Christian Missionary Society, the Christian Women Board of Missions, and then a couple other organizations that were focused on benevolence. Right, so outreach to the people, helping them out. And so those groups were going to combine to focus this. The American Christian Missionary Society's president at the time would become the president of the United Christian Missionary Society. McLean, who was the president of the Foreign Christian Missionary Society, you don't need to all know all this, but I'm just kind of giving you an idea here. You should generally know what the United Christian Missionary Society was, but not all the details. Right? So the president of the American Christian Missionary Society became the president of the United Christian Missionary Society. Archibald McLean was president of the Foreign Christian Missionary Society. In the new organization, he became vice president. There was another vice president. That was the person who had led the Christian Women's Board of Missions, a woman named at the time, well, I guess she was named more than just at the time. At the time, the woman was Anna Atwater. She was the president at the time. So she becomes the other vice president. Right? So the leadership of these previous organizations become the leaders of this new group. The board of the United Christian Missionary Society would include members. Half of them would be men, half of them would be women. And the focus would be on missions, the recruitment of ministers, retirement benefits for ministers, right? We've moved into this more pastor-type system, and so there was a lot of concern about when a minister gets older, what can the church do to help support that person when they get to the point where they're not able to do anything. Well, an individual congregation might not be able to support the new preacher, right, that they have, and support this old preacher. And so this organization developed to try and help provide kind of a retirement benefits for these older preachers instead of leaving that to the local congregations. And so missions, things related to ministers, benevolence, religious education, were all a part of this new organization. But there were still some within the disciples who were very concerned that this was a further step away from congregational autonomy. By having this board that was kind of controlling missionary activity, a lot of people in local congregations started to say, well, that's kind of, you're getting to the point of telling us what to do, as opposed to the local congregation being separate. The last concern that we'll talk about today, and we'll pick up some things on Thursday, was within the disciples, there are those theological liberals that are accepting a lot of those things that we started off with. And there are also theologically conservative people. Right? People that believe in the inspiration of the Bible, people that believe in special creation in 6 days of human beings. And so those theologically conservative people are very concerned about if the leadership of this group is theologically liberal, where's that going to take not only this group, this missionary society, but the disciples as a whole? Right? And so you're starting to see this concern between the liberals and the conservatives about, what's the trajectory that the disciples of Christ are on. We'll pick up with that trajectory on Thursday and flesh that out a little bit more.